I know it's not easy to drag yourself away from the beach and various other things that we like to do when it's sunny. So we're very happy to welcome Sean to the bookshop again. And I was trying to remember when Wild Nathan came out. It was COVID. And do you remember we did an interview on the Green?
Right.
It was actually really good. I thought it was one of my better ones. Yeah, it was so lovely. Yeah, it was
on the YouTube channel.
Yeah, on our sort of YouTube channel. So this time it's so lovely that we're all together,
Okay.
not just the two of us, although that was lovely on the Green. So this is your follow-up book, but you're going.
It is a follow-up
to Wild Nathan, or companion, I suppose.
Yeah.
So you're going to take us through it tonight, your whole story behind it, and you'll read
we'll have some discussion as well at the end, perhaps.
And
more wine.
And there's some more wine if you want some. So I'll pass back to Sean, and thank you everyone again. So lovely.
Thank you, Rach. Thanks Neil for the invitation to give Unveiling the Sun its first outing in the shop here. So what I'd like to do this evening, I know that there are other things making claims on your time, like I don't know, the beach or maybe the football. What I'd like to do is just to say something about about how this book came about. I'd like to read from the book, and then there might be some questions or maybe even the occasion for a bit of discussion afterwards. I think of this book as the third installment of what you might call a trilogy, although it was never really conceived of as a trilogy. But there are two other books that kind of led to this, and that is Eagle Country, which appeared in 2018, and Wild Nathan, which was published in 2020, as Breed said, at the height of the pandemic. So we didn't actually have a launch of Wild Nathan. It did occur to me that perhaps we should be launching Wild Nathan as well this evening. So Unveiling the Sun then is it's really a book which is culled from about 20 years of keeping notebooks about weather, days spent out and about, walking, exploring, fishing, looking at wildlife. And as well as that, there are some just quite casual observations about stuff we saw or I saw in the garden or around the house at home. So there was no particular agenda in a lot of this writing. It wasn't, these notebook entries weren't part of some grand scheme. They were just scattered across about 20 years, perhaps even a bit more than 20 years, being out and about in the Mayo countryside. So you might say, or I might, I suppose, claim that some of the writing has really no literary accent at all. It was just a private note, something that was scribbled down fairly quickly at the end of a day, when often you were maybe tired and you really didn't feel like writing, but you thought, hey, I should make a record of this moment. So much of the writing, I would say, isn't literary or isn't deliberately literary. But then, of course, a bit later on, as you have the experience of publishing a book or books about wildlife and landscape and dealing with editors and trying to decide whether such and such a phrase is appropriate or is this style right or so on, there is then the kind of the literary thing that creeps in to the whole process. So I'm saying that this is a miscellaneous book. There are different kinds of writing here, different accents, and some of it perhaps has a more literary bent, while some of the earlier entries are, as I say, more casual. In French, there is a distinction between something called écriture and littérature, and I would say both of them are actually represented here. The écriture bit just being writing, and littérature is something with perhaps more pretensions, a kind of writing that comes from the pressure of style and scrutiny by editors and so on. So by and large, the notebook entries here try to describe something, to make a record of perhaps the weather, of a moment in the natural world, an effect of scenery, or the pattern of a journey, perhaps a day out walking on foot in the mountains. Now, there wasn't usually any intention of saying anything about private emotions or feelings. There's no. I wasn't ever on a mission, I think, to talk about myself and my own feelings. What interested me usually was something that was outside of myself, something external to myself. But that's not to say that there is no person here, or no presence of the writer or the notebook keeper. You'll notice that some scenes have a habit of drawing my attention more than others. And that in itself gives the book a certain bias or a certain colour. You might say, this guy is interested in X and Y and Z, but he says nothing about such and such, and that, that's it. That's fine as far as I'm concerned. I also think that if this book is boring, then I'm boring. So that's fine. At least it's an accurate record of the person that I am. But just coming back again to the idea of the person of the writer, I think the person of the writer is here, although, as I say, there was no intention of exploring private emotions or private feelings. I think the very fact of being drawn back to the same area over many years means that the place itself starts to impress itself on the person. And at the same time, the writer reveals certain things about this favourite landscape that might not have been celebrated before. And I'm talking, of course, mostly about the landscape of North Mayo, particularly the area of the Nafinbeg Mountains and the valleys on either side, and also coming a little bit farther south to the area of Fahy where we live, and north of Fahy, so between Fahy and Beltra Loch, shall we say. So you have a place and you have a person, you have a place and a writer, and it's not a one-way process, it's really a two-way process. The writer builds part of his own self through this repeated exposure to a place. But in the process, and I think here's the thing that we've perhaps learned from writers like Robert Macfarlane over the last few years, in the process, I think the place itself is changed somehow. Places are really a composite of what we know about them, of the stories that are told about a particular landscape, of things that have been seen and done, and of events in that place, and things that have been celebrated. So places do rely on people, on their reports, on their stories, for their identity. And I'll quote from Robert Macfarlane's book, The Old Ways, which is very much focused on this idea that a landscape actually, exists and has its identity, not just out there, not just as a piece of geology, but as something that we know, we can understand. And Macfarlane says in The Old Ways, he says, how people understand themselves using landscape, by the topographies of self we carry within us, and by the maps we make with which to navigate those interior terrains. I think that's kind of worth reading again. He's talking at the beginning of this book, The Old Ways. He talks about how people understand themselves using landscape, by the topographies of self we carry within us, and by the maps we make with which to navigate those interior terrains. So it is it's a two-way process, and in the process there is building one's own identity, and at the same time adding to the identity of a particular place.
Yeah.
And I think I've been very fortunate over the last, I would say, over 20 years in having regular access to the North Mayo landscape, a landscape that is not densely populated, which offers itself, I think, not as a tabula rasa, not as a clean sheet, but certainly as a place where there is room for more stories and more exploration. And I know that after 20 odd years going there regularly, you still haven't exhausted it. There is still much more to be explored. Okay, so that if you like is kind of my understanding of what this book is about. So what I'd like to do then, I just crave your indulgence for a while. I'd like to read a series of extracts from the journal entries. Most of them are fairly short, and I'm going to indulge myself and ask for your patience to read one somewhat longer extract as well, describing a storm, one of the great winter storms we had some years ago. Okay, so the book is structured as a single calendar year across all 12 months. I don't have an entry for every day of the year, but there are over 200 entries, and they span 20 years, but they are structured, compiled as a single calendar year. 14th of January, Morava. We drove to Mulrenny after breakfast to walk before midday, as rain was forecast from lunchtime. A brownish juvenile sparrowhawk flew ahead of us along the road and disappeared around a corner. As we approached, it flew again from its perch, gliding very low, barely a foot above the road, and turned to perch on a branch, flying again along the road as the car came near. It did this 5 times before we eventually lost sight of it. The previous evening, another sparrowhawk had flown past me as it was getting dark, low across a field, very flat, thin and shadowy, like those military planes designed to evade detection by radar, an essence of concealment. That bird was barely an incarnation of a shadow in twilight, and still it was enough to portend death to the redwings. Wind was stirring in the tall spruce as we got near Mulrenny. The links golf course was cropped very tight. It must be commonage, and had a peaty look in places where sheep hooves had poached the ground. The putting greens were green, as they are fenced off and sheep don't graze there. Wind was brisk off the sea, almost a gale, wrapping the golfers tightly in their black weatherproofs. Gulls floated easily on the updraft off the brow of the dunes. Rough waves were a steady commotion at the beach, now exposed. We followed an otter's prints along the top of the beach, close to the stony margin. The animal had gone along the shore earlier that morning, and we followed its trail, tempted by the chance of a sighting. 200 yards of this, and the tracks came to an end. It dawned on me that at that point the animal had entered the water, which must have been higher at that moment, close to where we were standing. We were left stranded in our land-bound state by this magician of water. Little hope was left of seeing it in the windy commotion of waves. A few dozen dunlin and sanderling were feeding in the little bay around the corner. I was too tight in the cold to pause to count them. A single curlew took off, quote, like a guilty thing surprised. It did not want to be questioned about its dramatic decline as a breeding species. Deposits of rock, seaweed and plastic had been rearranged by storms since we were last here. We turned inland at the extreme point and came back across the Macker. A clean, fresh portion of fleece with hooves and bones was all that remained of a young sheep that had perished. The land itself had the appearance of a scavenged carcass. Life itself took on this extreme economy. A flock of small waders flew across, a brief glimmer of urgency. Shelley's thinnest boat for the soul of January. The standing stone with a limestone cairn at its foot, marking the children's burial ground, was the only thing that seemed worthy of a photograph. Life was a marvel today in the cold and penury, so its early extinction deserved to be respected and remembered. The infants buried here away from consecrated ground were miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant deaths, consigned to limbo without the passport of baptism. This heart of winter is itself limbo, when there is scarcely a hope of new life stirring. The accent is on staying, being, surviving. One chough trying to forage on a poached stretch of ground was an emblem of the place, its cracked voice like a fuller idiom worn thin by the territory, a worn-down jackdaw. We paused on the brow of the dune to admire the lacework of waves, the darkness of stone which 4 brent geese had vanished into. Fifth of February. My hawthorns are showing no signs of growth yet. Earlier this week in County Down, I saw tender new shoots of hawthorn in a park close to the sea. I used my new billhook to clear old growth from the base of the hawthorns. Water froze in basins last night, but the day was mild enough as I worked, the hollow swept by an occasional shower. Large, mixed squadrons of redwing and fieldfare whistled and chatted in the air above me, or landed in the fields below as if to discuss the terms of an elaborate strategy. Later on, starlings gathered in the tall beech trees sounded like a cascade, with sporadic whistles jumping from the stream of undifferentiated sound. A sheep has died in the long field. Its carcass lies in the middle of the flat, attended by 2 ravens and a gang of hoodies. The other sheep have deserted the flat and occupy the top part of the slope. The sky at 5:30 is a lid of grey cloud with one break at the horizon around Mount Trasna. A pale apricot background sets the plateau in silhouette. Heavy drops of mild rain as it gets dark. 18th of May. I sat in the garden between the 2 hazels and realised that a robin pair were feeding young in a nest on the ground just beside Blackbird Alley. They hesitated a lot before going in because I was there. Jessica arrived and we watched them. They were still very hesitant. Then Jessica decided to go back to the house, and when she did, the robins returned immediately and were less shy than before. They scarcely noticed me. They thought that the human had gone back to the house with Jessica, and I remained as a natural part of the garden. All this is going on 10 yards from the kitchen window, but it was only revealed when I sat in the garden, taking a different perspective. The next piece is a short piece from July, and by July, kind of the fabric of the year is influenced, in my case, by the prospects of fishing when the spate streams of North Mayo rise during floods or after floods. And this is just a shorter reflection on perhaps some longer excursions in those areas, which are also referred to in the book at greater length. 5th of July. Welcome. Welcome, Eli. Welcome, Alice. I think about the expanse of the upper river as a brooding mass, still holding on to its secrets. The angler goes there with hopes, with the urge to wrestle something from that place in the form of a few fish, and manages that, but all the time the place takes its toll on him. The weather and midges pester him. The scale of the land saps his energies. The hunt for fish comes at a cost. His composure, his ambitions to be master of the place. But as night falls and the rain clouds reclaim Corshleave, another series of presences overwhelms him, like a set of unanswered questions about light and darkness, the appearance of water in the small hours, the behaviour of birds early in the morning, that unidentified cry from a higher valley. Fox, was it? Some hunted creature going about its business with no inkling that anyone were there to hear its shout at the scree. And then the cattle that are here in summer resolving reds and whites into appearance after the brief intermission of a midsummer night, showing that this valley, for all its remoteness, is territory for a farmer's livestock, as it has been in summer since at least the 18th century. These cattle, like the sheep you see dragging heavy fleece across the fords, tell you about economy and subsidy schemes and the mendacity that goes with stocking levels in these parts. I'll skip into September and I'll read a portion of a slightly longer extract referring to a visit to Tarsacon and to a meeting with a man called Podge McHugh, who's referred to in the earlier book Wild Nathan. 21st of September. Podge is standing at the corner of his house at Tarsacon when I arrive, with his usual air of having expected me. As mist and drizzle flows in, we stand in the shelter of a derelict old van to chat. He tells me about a few salmon that have run up the river and of dark sea trout. There are no fresh fish following the earlier flood last week. The deer rut hasn't started yet, but there is a small herd in the forestry. He has found several sets of antlers over the years. When I mention my intention to walk to the top of Slieve, he tells me that there was a trap at the summit, Cairn, years ago, to catch hawks. Then the drizzle eases, and after various assessments of the weather, I set out. Another pulse of drizzle forces me into the shelter of a gorse bush beside the stream. A grey wagtail hunts for insects along the stones at the water's edge, then flies away upstream with another, perhaps its mate for this season. Then I wade across the river, keeping a careful eye on the rim of my Wellington boots. While I have walked along this river many times during floods, this is one of the rare occasions that I have crossed to the other side, and the first time that I leave the bright succession of pools and streams for the open bog. Within a few hundred metres, the apparent monotony of this landscape gives way to variety in the terrain. A vein of rushes and scabious at the start of a small watercourse. A hollow where shelter gives heather a chance to grow tall and lush. The furrows from the passage of a farmer's quad bike. Some way off I see a thick fleece on the ground and think it might be a dead sheep, but the animal stands up when I get close. I notice that its eyes are opaque, milky, and I realise that this animal is blind. It doesn't bleat or show any signs of distress and just stands there, alert to my presence. A lost creature in such a place strikes me forcefully as the epitome of loneliness. I have heard stories of hooded crows attacking the eyes of weakened sheep, even perching on their horns to bring them down. A little farther on, another visible dark seam in the bog expands to become the bank of a shallow lake with a tiny island where the vegetation is never grazed. As you cross flat terrain, these bog lakes are often invisible until you get to within fewer than 100 yards. Lonely, bog-locked surfaces of glitter ringed by peat banks just a couple of feet high. Pipits and larks fly up from the short heather. One skylark is startled by my approach. A red grouse sounds its churring note somewhere in the distance. Then a series of calls alerts me to a female merlin chasing a lark high in the air, as if this were a contest over a territory of sky rather than a creature's flight for its life. The lark jinks and surges above the merlin, then dives suddenly to the ground, where the merlin misses it and flies off to the south. I have not seen this falcon here for years, and am grateful for this reward after only half an hour's walk away from the river. The ground rises slightly above the Merlin Lake, then crosses a broad, flat shelf before continuing to rise more steeply towards Slieve Alp. Mist is rolling in again, obscuring the top of the hill, so I head for a large boulder where I take some time. The fox has been here. I kick away a fresh piece of fox turd before sitting down with a ground sheet for extra shelter. My back is to the hill. The bog I have just crossed is my vista, brown with tints of ginger, even in the dreich, overcast conditions. The distance to the south is comprised of bands of grey until all colour and shape are lost in mist. I half expect an eagle or harrier to materialise out of these conditions, but none shows. When the drizzle arrives again in denser swathes, I decide to abandon today's destination and go back. The wettest section of the bog is also its most colourful now. Intense red sundews, swollen great bundles of blossom at the tips of cross-leaved heath, ling in flower, salmon pink and orange flames of bog asphodel gone to seed, yellowing tips of molinia and beaked sedge, the leaves of molinia now at their darkest, cotton grass and intense fiery chestnut, wine, yellow and green sphagnum, the biggest clumps like heaps of an oriental spice, heraldic tormental leaves, pale matrices of stag's horn moss, and a tiny pale butterwort in flower above its short rosette of sticky insectivorous leaves. Some animal, the fox, has been rooting into the ground for food, leaving small cup shapes in the vegetation. I find a little nest of 4 carder bees in one of them. They are damp and drowsy, as if they had been binging on this year's mellow fruitfulness. My binoculars find a young stag calmly grazing along the forestry edge in mid-afternoon. By the time I get back to the river, another clearance has uncovered the top of the hill. I did not wait long enough and have missed today's opportunity, O me of little faith. Podge has been clearing thistles and burdock in the field next to his house with a curious billhook. The blade is very broad, more like a medieval weapon of war than a farmer's tool. He is very glad to hear about the missing sheep, which is one of this year's ewe lambs, and he will go out to collect it. So if I can just beg for your indulgence for just a little while, I'd like to read a piece about Stormophilia and then 2 shorter extracts to finish. Stormophilia actually was the 15th and the 16th of October, but I'll just read a portion from the 16th, from the second day of the storm. We've had several significant storms, of course, over the years, but on this occasion, I sort of made a point of trying to record it, trying to note it. 6 a.m. I woke and went to the bathroom. Then I lay in bed listening to the wind. A few slates clicked as they vibrated. Occasional buzzings told of aphasia thrumming in the air's energy. Then there were more diffuse whooshings and wind coming around the house, friction between air and concrete. Were there also, I wondered, in these surges, sounds of friction of air around a gable, meeting another rush of air coming against it? And so the verbs become pure gerund, having no object, being just an action in itself. Another softer sound began on the roof above me, of big drops falling, as if a cat with 1,000 paws had crossed the slates and vanished. That was succeeded by a denser pattern, as if a sequence of waves had tossed a froth of small fish onto the roof repeatedly. Then, stronger still, came a beating like sheaves of oats being struck against the top of the house as the raindrops rebounded. Last of all, after an interval, came the hum of pouring where you could not distinguish individual drops. The rain came as one continuous sound, like a crop of fruit being released down a chute into a hopper in a single night. 9 a.m. The wind is easterly, gusting to gale force, not yet a storm. The fields seem empty, as if a pitch had been prepared for some great legendary encounter. The searching eye finds sheep in the lee of the drumlins, still going about their business. The oak foliage is a surf of green shot with golden orange, swaying and shifting in a dance it is unaccustomed to, because strong winds here are normally from the west, not the east. Like a girl who puts her hands in front of her skirt to protect her modesty and is shocked when the breeze lifts her skirt from behind. The rage of trees keeps pace with alarming news bulletins, a blend of retrospect and anticipation. But then the agitation relents. The surf of leaves calms down, just as in the interval between large waves the frothy surface settles briefly. A yellow sun leaks down onto the horizon through grey cloud for a few minutes, until an approaching fog of rain draws the curtain on this light. A flock of 7 whooper swans recently arrived from Iceland steers big winds unsteadily into the valley, looking for a lake to take their cumbersome weight. 11:15. Beyond the oaks, the hawthorn hedges are without leaves. A rich crop of haws has darkened, the fruit having dried out somewhat since August, when the red berries were flush in their bouquet of leaves. Wind is more southerly. The treetops are pushing towards the house. The movement is hesitant, less strong than an hour ago, as if Aeolus were breathing in, getting ready for the next blow. A glaring column of sunlight rises to the southwest over the Partry Mountains, glints on rooftops for a few seconds and diminishes as the stairway to heaven is withdrawn skyward. Air and cloud mass are now distinctly southerly. 12:30. Wind is increasing in strength. The windows upstairs facing south are now a fine blur, as fine rain is being blown against them and the distance darkens. The west gable is still clear for viewing. Poplars are bare looking, with just a thin remnant of dark, dried up leaves. Each point is like the tip of a fly rod that has hooked a big trout bending northwards. More rain is being flung in squalls at the window panes. The best dressed trees, oak, beech and alder, are now toiling in distress, while their naked cousins, rowan and poplar, stand by demurely. The most beautiful apparition of all, though, in this daytime gathering is a mature arbutus at the gate. It benefits from this realignment of perspectives. The summer's pale new growth is still fresh and luxuriant, as this is not a deciduous tree, and the creamy bells of its flowers are just appearing along its flanks. It is less distressed than the deciduous trees and is enjoying the storm dance, shifting and wobbling its spongy mass. This female tree has not yet fruited. It is still trying to attract a male, which explains its voluptuous dance. 1400. Rain sets in again in earnest. Hollywood rain, where directors have fire hoses aimed at cars, streets and buildings. Jess and I sit over dinner as water streams down the windows or bounces off the walls outside. A lone mallard crossing the sky has the speed and purpose of a fighter aircraft on a sortie at the height of the Battle of Ophelia. By the time we are drinking tea following the meal, the wind has slackened again as the rain eases. For a brief interval, the hedges are almost calm. This is the moment the eye of the storm passes. Then, as I take a phone call from my son Seamus, the wind picks up again, this time from the west, its usual quarter. This is the wind we know, the one we have made provision for, planting a hedge with trees, including a line of 18 black poplars along the western side of the garden. We have endured many fierce nights from that quarter, and we feel that we can cope with this as well. Now the deluging rain from lunchtime has spread from the Moyor stream into the fields. The floodwaters are a muddy brown colour, as this spate has been so sudden, flushing out drains and ditches. Water also lies on the surface of the fields, like broad applications of grey or green. 1700. We watch the poplars, pines and alders nodding in the gale, a sight we are well accustomed to, having sat through storms of force 10 and 11 several times. If the wind doesn't increase further, we are now hopeful that the worst may be over. The oak grove, which entertained us this morning with its southeasterly dance of leaf surf, is relatively quiet as it lies in the lee of other plantings on the western side. Already it is possible to speak of this storm's legacy. Drifts of sycamore leaves torn from 2 trees at the gate are thick and sodden, piled near the front door. 1740. A steady westerly gale in the poplars. Rain starts again, a mizzle greying in the distance. 1830. We put on high-vis waistcoats and go out. Roads deserted. The river a mass of brown water. Hawthorns along the river are stark above their reflections on the floodwater. We walk through water near the Dipper Bridge. The brook out of Hazelbrook is bolting urgently away like a guilty thing. A gloomy world. Just 2 shorts to finish. 15th of November. The evening was damp and foggy, so the supermoon was hidden. When I got up at 6:15, the moon was hanging over Lavelle's Haggard, its light flooding our landing. The house cast a distinct shadow. Our cars had moon gleams on their bodywork, and the long monocotyledon blades of New Zealand flax each had a reflected moon at their tip. I took up binoculars to study this moon, which did not excel others I have watched from the house. Instead, it was the trees that caught my attention. A line of bare ash stood against the milky glow of clouds. They were etched black and wet to emphasize their blackness in complete lifelessness. They reminded me of D.H. Lawrence's almond trees in Sicily in December, quote, like iron implements, twisted, hideous out of the earth, unquote. Without their leaves, these bare ash were completely objects of winter. 31st of December. Walked to Braca. Did the new loop behind the manor. Beeches wonderful in their muscular main trunk and branches. The manor was lit very brightly as we walked back, lowering grey sky to the west as a squall approached. Rain came on as we went down the drive to Anna's. She was not there. We got fairly wet walking home, but there was an exhilaration in the exposure, the air dancing bright, adorning the shorn hedge tops with rain glitter. It is we who let it down with our muddy traces. We drove into Westport after lunch. Intensest glare on the wet road surface from a low sun. I saw this glare on Lough Field last winter, as if water gathered winter brightness from the dormant earth. A near full moon in the evening. So, could I just before perhaps